Scramble by I Had Him on the Ropes, Carter Reed, and Rory Gone Matty, Roast into Days. Chapter 11, Day 737, Afternoon. Bruce received the summons to Watchtower 15 minutes after he'd woken from his nap. It was little after noon, which Alfred had informed him was long enough in bed, thank you, Master Wayne, even with your extracurricular activities. Bruce would have snarked back that his mentor was just as to blame, feeding him breakfast at 4 a.m. before packing him off to sleep at 5 a.m., but a single eyebrow raising into Alfred's hairline made him pause. Alfred had been both brutally honest in his opinion about the Clark situation and equally understanding. He would never truly forgive Clark the pain he put Bruce through, but he was still the same traditionalist he had always been, and he knew that his ward's best chance of happiness had always lain with the owner of the words on his skin. Words that used to be on his skin. He hadn't spoken to Bruce for 2 days at that revelation. Then he'd pulled the man he so often saw as a boy into a bone-crushing hug. "You, Master Wayne, are a stubborn fool," he'd breathed, tears in his voice, and that was the last they'd spoken of it. Alfred had taken the position that while Clark should know who lay beneath the cowl, and Bruce should not ignore any growing feelings that surged at the sight of Superman, he should be cautious. Desperately cautious. "And if you take that man to bed before I give my approval, Master Wayne, you will be nibbling around laundry and meals for a year," he swore, like Bruce would do much without his guardian on board. Even when reluctant, even when cursing his ward, Alfred still sat at the monitors in the cave, patched up his wounds, and made him tea at the end of a long shift. It was that sort of support Bruce needed, especially when Dick barely spoke to him anymore in the implosion that was his relationship with Jason. Bruce had tried to blame everyone for that. Jason himself, Alfred, even Felipe Garzanas. But really, it was down to him. His decision hadn't been easy, but he decided with Alfred's approval to tell Clark who he was when the Kryptonian came to get closure with Brucey. He only hoped he'd be able to keep his nerve. The billionaire managed to polish off an almost empty box of Pop-Tarts before pulling on the suit and cowl, slipping into the Batplane, stealth mode firmly on, of course, and jetting towards Watchtower, Alfred's snuggy remarks echoing in his ear. Watchtower had flourished in the months since its inception in an abandoned Metropolis warehouse, and even Bruce, if he was honest with himself, enjoyed being in the place. It was an atmosphere that the cave lacked, an optimism, a light, and eagerness that was found often in children and rarely in those who had been fighting for as long as Bruce had. It was a pleasant break from Gotham, no matter how much he loved his city, even if he had to endure the bouncing enthusiasm of Barry, who had spent several of the Bat's last visits lording his triumph over Abracadabra, a villain who had, Bruce later discovered, been forcing his audiences to clap for him after his magic performances via hypnotic device. Flash had explained it more thoroughly, of course, and the clever way in which he defeated such a foe, but the only thought in Bruce's head had been, "This boy is so lucky the Joker finds him dull." It wasn't unusual for the hallways to be empty, but it was strange to see the League were all already seated at their round table, a dip into his sentimental side, looking somber, their brows drawn tight. "Batman?" Diana greeted with a firm nod, not rising from her seat. It was Barry, though, who gave the game away. Barry, who wouldn't meet his eyes, choosing instead to fix his gaze at the center of the table itself. Barry, who did it bound up to him, nattering at 100 miles an hour, ignorant of any irritation Bruce might be feeling. "Diana?" the billionaire returned, tilting his head just enough to convey his confusion. Clark wasn't looking at him either. His eyes were red, too, and not in the about-to-laser-through-steel way. "Please sit, Batman," she replied, sounding every inch the princess they all knew she was. Bruce complied, moving slowly but keeping every sense alert. She took in a deep breath once he'd settled. "If I'm honest, Batman, I'm not really sure where to start. I do!" Hal cut in immediately, angry and uncontrolled. "He sold us out!" "Lantern," Diana hissed. "No! he shouted, pushing back his chair and standing, arms thrown wide and ring flashing bright green for a moment. I mean, finding his secret kill in case one of us goes bad plans was bad enough. But finding out he's been hooking up with Bruce fucking Wayne. Bruce fucking Wayne, who knows our identities. We don't. If he's told Wayne Superman's identity, you can't think he hasn't told him ours too, Princess. Come on! I mean, seriously! There was a moment where nothing other than, what? Bounded around the inside of Batman's skull. For once, no plan immediately sprang to mind, nor was there an explanation. He couldn't understand what they were accusing him of, why they were accusing him of it, or how they'd come to the incorrect conclusion about Wayne. Why was Wayne even mentioned? Somehow he managed to hold up a hand, silencing their shouting match, although Hal looked even more incensed at being quietened like a dog. He stared straight across the table, trying to catch Clark's eye, but when that failed, Bruce turned and pinned the white lenses of his cowl to Arthur, who had as of then been completely silent. Explain, he demanded, voice colder than ice. Victor found contingency plans installed in the watchtower sub-protocols. Automatic responses to neutralize us. Should we decide villainy paid better, we presume. He began, tone flat, factual, and dispassionate, exactly what Bruce wanted in the middle of such insanity. She called Clark, who was in Metropolis, putting out a house fire. Once we explained, he'd assured us it was a misunderstanding. He flew to Gotham to find you. He was about to give up when he suddenly heard your heartbeat. He followed it and ended up over Wayne Manor. We heard you talking to Wayne's butler. Apparently the man isn't a fan of his. He paused, ignorant of how Bruce was 15 seconds from a panic attack. Then he heard you talking to Wayne. Apparently the three of you shared a joke at his expense. Obviously Clark was upset, but it wasn't until he got back to Watchtower that he realized Wayne had called him Clark. How had Clark heard three people? He hadn't... The cowl. He took the cowl off, modulated, then not modulated, and three heartbeats. Alfred's, his, and the automated one built into the suit. Crap! 3! How though? You cracked the shielding. The cave is vulnerable. The sensors must be damaged too. The cave is compromised! The League is compromised! Hal was shouting, and it was clear Bruce had missed some further explanation, but he couldn't see past the colossal screw-up that was happening around him. Barry looked on the verge of tears. Your identities are not compromised, he growled, furious at the distrust because these people gave away their identities to everyone. But in their eyes, the Batman trusts one person, and he gets... Sim Wayne is your benefactor, Victor chimed in, tone significantly calmer than those around him. The others blinked in shock, clearly not having considered such a thing. Your take is second to none. No doubt most of the prototypes. How can you get access to them without millions? What? Wayne's your sugar daddy, is that it? Hal spat. You roll over and what? He gives you toys. Bruce ignored the urge to punch Jordan until his face collapsed in on itself. And the wounded noise that torn itself from Clark's throat. Is that how you get kicks? Fucking Superman's soulmate. He financed the Watchtower too, didn't he? Diana asked quietly, an authority in her voice that didn't need volume, and deliberately ignoring the vulgarity Hal was spewing. That will explain his financials, and the off-the-book stuff we couldn't crack into, he added, turning to Clark. Shit, how deep in are you with this fool? Hal cursed, slamming his hands down on the table. Lantern, Diana ordered. Sit down. This is... Did he know it was me? At the gala? Did he know? Clark's voice was fragile, and Bruce had an overwhelming, violent urge to remove the cowl. He wanted to. He wanted to take the broken, desperate, heart-wrenching tone and burn it to ash because for the first time, he didn't want Clark to experience what he had. He didn't want Clark to bury himself in pain and throw himself at fights in the hope the agony would stop. He didn't want Clark to be forced before a fireplace and do what had to be done. Maybe that made him pathetic. Maybe it made him strong. But while that side raged, The Batman was cold fury. They were supposed to be past this. Clark had spent their morning talking about assumptions and misunderstandings and wanting to move on. And here he was, making assumptions, not giving time for any explanation. They had already reached their verdict. They all had. Clark had. It seemed for all his talk he still wasn't ready. And Bruce had not spent years breaking his knuckles and spitting out teeth to have his identity given away to soothe a broken man's soul and a petulant man's anger. It was worth more than that. He was worth more than that. So rather than yield to the whims of the angry or the upset, he simply rose slowly, presence as dominating as he could make it. Your identities are not compromised, he repeated, ignoring the half-sob that came with his silence to Clark's question. And if they are, it is through your own actions. I trusted you! Barry choked out, face crumpled in the kind of despair a child has at hearing of their parents' separation. A broken laugh bubbled up from between Batman's lips. And I you, but trust is not complacency flesh. His voice dropped from disbelief and understated rage. I trusted you knew the kind of person I was, he added, unwilling to move his gaze from Clark. But apparently not. And he was sure his thoughts mirrored Clark's own. But the man sat opposite had all but said he loved him. How could he feel that and believe that he would jeopardize the identities of the League? How could he be in love and believe that Bruce would willingly humiliate him, turn him into a bad joke? He couldn't. He couldn't. And while it took an age to decide to tell Clark it was him beneath the mask, it took no time at all to decide not to. I quit. Shock. Silence. The sound of heavy boots on hard floor, the low hum of the engines of the Batplane. Then, Alfred. A productive meeting, sir? A deep, rasping, near hysterical breath. The cave shielding is compromised, he replied, not removing the cowl and striding to the nearest workbench. Superman is listening. Alfred's answering gasp was swallowed by the spitting of the blowtorch and the blazing roar of blood in Bruce's ears.